We are really happy to have this opportunity to talk about an issue that's very dear to the members of Nodutdol. Nodutdol, for those who don't know, is a progressive organization made up of members of the Korean diaspora in America and allies. And one of the core beliefs of all the members of Nodutdol is the peaceful reunification of the Korean peninsula. And so we put together this teach-in not as experts in policy or as experts in history, but really as people who are engaged in community and activists who are presenting our particular viewpoint onto the current peace talks and issues in the Korean peninsula. Today, of course, marks the 65th anniversary of the signing of the Korean armistice in July 27th, 1953. Now, the armistice brought a halt to the Korean War, but as we know, in October of 1953, the US and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, entered a mutual defense agreement, breaking the armistice. And to date, there's been no official peace treaty signed between North and South Korea. So the Korean War is technically ongoing. It is an ongoing conflict. The US, of course, still has something like 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea. And so this history, the history of the quote-unquote forgotten war, as it's called in America, the Korean War, is really the crucial backdrop to everything that we'll be discussing tonight. And historical context is very important to Nodutdol in terms of making sense of these current issues. 5 years ago, members of this group and other allies marched on the White House saying 60 years since the armistice was long enough and that it was time to sign a peace treaty. 5 years later, a lot of us were dismayed to hear last year talks of a possible nuclear war. There was some very alarming and disconcerting talk happening from the White House. And so a lot of us, I think, were very gratified and interested and hopeful, tentatively, to see the developments this year. The cooperation between the North and South at the Pyeongchang Olympics. Of course, the historic summit in April between President Moon of South Korea and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And of course, the historic summit in June between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, which was the first time a US president has met with the leader of North Korea since the Korean War. So what we're going to do this evening is present, we have 3 volunteers, Betsy representing North Korea, Yujin representing South Korea, and Rose, who will be discussing the US. So this triangle, right, of politics that we're very much engaged in. The first question that we're going to start off with is, why is this such a critical moment for these respective countries from these different standpoints? What is particular about this political situation now?
In terms of US-NK relations, as Ryan mentioned, it's the first time the two leaders have met since the Korean War. And another aspect is that because of North Korea's status as a nuclear state, this heightens the stakes for both countries if peace fails or if war breaks out. Whereas before, I think the US might have seen itself as not as vulnerable as North Korea. As for North Korea itself, North Korea is now a nuclear state, and the implications for this is that they have more leverage in negotiations than they did in their previous negotiations with the United States. In addition, the status quo for North Korea is a heightened state of war in an environment of economic sanctions, war games, and happening just below the 38th parallel. War games, for those you might not know, is what the US media calls military exercises. They're very provocative, and they practice military scenarios that include nuclear attack on North Korea and various other scenarios that are very threatening to North Korea.
I'll speak about 2 reasons why this is the most critical moment for South Korea. The first reason is about family separations and the possibility of reunification. Oh, sorry. Can you guys all hear me now? Yeah. Okay. I'm not used to speaking with a mic, so. Koreans who've been separated from their families by the war and the border are getting older, and many of many Koreans from the north and south and of the diaspora have not been able to see family members since the beginning of the Korean War. There are over 130,000 South Koreans who registered to be reunited with family in the north, and sadly over 50% of this number have passed away. So the youngest of those who've been separated from their family are now elderly. And we're running out of time to reunite these families. That's the first reason why it's a critical moment. The second reason that this is a critical moment for South Korea is that Moon Jae-in is in power. His administration came directly out of the Candlelight Revolution, and if you don't know, that's a series of massive protests that took place in South Korea between November of 2016 and March of 2017, which led to the eventual impeachment and imprisonment of then President Park Geun-hye. Elections were held, and then President Moon Jae-in was elected by the people. And because this administration, the current administration, was brought to power by this massive people's movement, there is enormous pressure on him to bring about change, as in bringing more transparency to political affairs, rooting out corruption within the government itself. And there's also a lot of expectation on him to improve relations with North Korea. Before his election, South Korea endured 9 years of deteriorating relations with the North under 2 successive conservative presidents. And the previous efforts to warm relations between the South and the North were basically undone during this period of time. Most South Koreans want to resume inter-Korean dialogue, that had been abandoned by the previous 2 administrations. And Moon has an 80% approval rating coming out of this most recent inter-Korean summit. And that's really his chance now to bring peace to the peninsula. This is why it's a critical moment from the South Korean perspective. And if we know anything from history, it could take a long time before we have another opportunity like this.
As far as why this is a critical moment for the U.S., there are several points. First, with last year's ICBM test, the U.S. has finally recognized that North Korea has an effective nuclear deterrent and that a preemptive strike against North Korea could have devastating consequences for the U.S. So increasingly, the military option is less of an option. Second, with the U.S.'s ongoing imperialist occupations in the Middle East, the U.S. can't afford to initiate another war in East Asia. They've been having trouble withdrawing troops from Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade, and they're also locked in conflicts in Syria and also with Iran. And finally, if the Trump regime wants to contain China, as it appears to be with the appointment of John Bolton as National Security Advisor and with the recent trade wars, the U.S. will want to focus its attention on China instead of North Korea or the Korean Peninsula.
So given this historical context and given what we're facing in the current situation, what are the stakes for each government? What are the win-loss scenarios? Why does this matter? What's pressing on each government to make these decisions right now?
So for North Korea, North Korea's survival as a state is at stake. I will go into this later, but the government-people distinction that we use to describe like U.S. people and U.S. government is not as applicable. They have a different social structure. But collapse of the North Korean state would be disastrous not only for the people that its collapse is would be purported to save, but also for South Korea and for China. So what's at stake is either war or status quo are the 2 options. Again, as I said earlier, in the event of war, there would be a devastating loss of life. During the Korean War, an estimated 1/4 to 1/3 of North Koreans were killed, and the U.S. dropped 32,000 tons of napalm on North Korea, basically leveling the country. In addition, economic sanctions are a form of warfare, and as we saw with Iraq, during the Clinton era, can lead to an appalling loss of life. Even if war does not break out, again, continuation of the status quo is a state of heightened military conflict and necessitates the channeling of funds towards building up their military defenses rather than focusing on social infrastructure. Another thing that's at stake for North Korea in its negotiations is the question of whether the U.S. will follow through on the agreements it makes. Brief history so I'm going to go through the Clinton, Bush, and Obama years really quickly. In '94, Clinton negotiated the agreed framework with North Korea, which was a freeze of 8 years on plutonium production. And then in 2000, the U.S. was supposed to buy all of North Korea's buy all of North Korea's medium and long-range missiles. They signed a mutual non-aggression treaty. However, the U.S. did not follow through with many of its commitments because, as some of you may know, the arduous march happened, and many policymakers in the U.S. believed that the state was on the brink of collapse, and that therefore they were hoping that would happen so they wouldn't have to follow through on the commitments that they made. Bush dropped all previous agreements, announced a preemptive strike strategy, and put North Korea on the axis of evil. Near the end of his term, there were six-party talks. North Korea blew up its cooling tower in Yongbyon in 2007 as a gesture of good faith, while Bush removed North Korea from the axis of evil. However, in the talks that happened there, again, administrators were hoping for collapse. Obama put forth a strategy of strategic patience combined with what he called the pivot to Asia. Strategic patience basically means the status quo, which, as I mentioned earlier, is itself a form of warfare.
So from the South Korean perspective, and this is going to expand a little bit on what Betsy already said, the stakes are the Korean people. If there are war, The Atlantic reported last year that according to one Pentagon estimate, even without nuclear weapons being used, the first days of such a war would see fatalities of 20,000 per day. Defense Secretary James Mattis has warned that a conflict of this magnitude could be catastrophic and probably the worst kind of fighting in most people's lifetimes. What does that mean? Last year, when tensions were high, Senator Lindsey Graham said, if there's going to be a war to stop Kim Jong-un, it will be over there. If thousands die, they're going to die over there. It's not going to be here. So acknowledging the scale of possible destruction and death, Graham's words belie just how the U.S. views the stakes in this. But from the South Korean view, there is actually here. It's Korean people, Korean livelihood, Korean well-being. And somewhere caught up in the tension between these two views is something that South Korea can gain from this peace process, and that's their sovereignty. The ability to control their own fates. So the U.S. currently holds something that's called wartime operational control. Operational control in general is the right to control military operations, and it's generally divided between wartime and peacetime command. And when the U.S. military first entered South Korea at the onset of the Korean War, General MacArthur was given command of the entire South Korean military. The U.S. military remained in South Korea ever since, as you may know, and only transferred peacetime operational control back to South Korea in 1994. U.S. generals continue to hold wartime operational control, which means that if there were a war today to break out on the peninsula, then a U.S. general by the name of Vincent Brooks would have command of the entire 5.8 million strong South Korean military force. However, even President Moon, who has had an appeasing approach towards the U.S. military, is pushing to gain South Korea's sovereignty. Last September, he declared his intention to retrieve South Korea's wartime operational control during an Armed Forces Day celebration. And the importance of Korea's sovereignty also appears in the peace declaration that came out this past spring. A phrase that appears in both this one and previous peace declarations is translated like this. South and North Korea affirm the principle of determining the destiny of the Korean nation on their own accord, which is 우리 민족끼리. With full sovereignty, South Korea will have the opportunity to more broadly question and redefine its long-standing bilateral alliance with the United States. The nature of this alliance is a military alliance, and so it is defined and given shape by the existence of a common enemy. That enemy position, which is occupied by North Korea, calls the alliance into existence. However, in order for this process, the peace process, to be effective, South Korea has to relinquish that position. South Korea must no longer see North Korea as an enemy. And if there's no longer an enemy, there's no reason for the alliance with the United States as it is. Thus, for South Korea, it's time to think of forming new alliances, perhaps regional ones, that could be built around a new model. And I'm going to quickly add one more thing that is at stake from the South Korean point of view is Moon's legacy. President Moon, up to this point, hasn't really come through on many of his campaign promises. And if the peace process fails, there isn't much that he can claim as his achievements.
As for the U.S., the state of U.S. hegemony itself seems to be at stake. First, the military-industrial complex will lose enormously if peace develops. I don't know how many people are aware of this in the room, but in the last 5 years, South Korea has been second to Saudi Arabia in purchasing U.S. arms. Also, in the face of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, the power and authority of the U.S. itself would diminish if North Korea is allowed to be a de facto nuclear state. Second, the legacy and the narrative of the Korean War seems to be at stake. Will the U.S. still be able to call the Korean War the Forgotten War? And it's interesting to consider how that title has served to obscure the violence that the U.S. government has committed against the Korean people for 70 years. Also at stake in the event of peace is the potential for developing new markets and trade with North Korea. And finally, for Donald Trump, what's at stake is his historical legacy and public perception. Clearly, ending the Korean War will appear as a success for his administration.
Great, thank you. Which brings us to what are the strategies these different governments are using to gain their wins? What is the approach of each of these governments to the peace talks?
I just wanted to add to Yujin's thing, the fact that operational control remains in the wartime operational control remains in the hands of the United States lends credence to the North Korean perspective of the Korean War as a war of American aggression against Korea. Notably, South Korea was not present at the armistice signing, and so a peace treaty ending the conflict would have to be between the United States and North Korea. Okay, so what is the North Korean government's approach? Its demands have remained consistent since the signing of the armistice in 1953. It wants peace. What would peace mean? Peace would be a non-aggression treaty with the United States. The implications for this has implications for the U.S.-South Korea military alliance, including end to war games and an end to the mutual defense treaty between South Korea and the United States. Peace also means an end to the Korean War and normalization of relations with the United States. This would include things like having an embassy and would allow for situations such as the Otto Warmbier situation or when the journalists were taken into custody by North Korea to be more easily resolved through diplomacy rather than through threats and fronting. And peace would also mean an end to sanctions. And another demand is Korean sovereignty over the reunification process. As Yujin said, 우리 민족끼리 between the Korean people. So North Korea's nuclear, and another aspect of North Korea's strategy is that their nuclear capability provides North Korea with more leverage to make these demands in the first place. If the U.S. had followed through with its commitments outlined in the agreed framework in '94, North Korea would likely not be a nuclear state today. Its pursuit of a nuclear strategy hasn't been for the sake of gaining nuclear status, but for leverage to achieve its demands. Another point is that North Korea is always presented in the U.S. media as devious and untrustworthy, but it has always been upfront with its stated intentions. Rose mentioned the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and so as an example, rather than remaining in the NPT and covertly pursuing nuclearization, it withdrew formally from the NPT in 2003. In contrast, U.S. has been and is a continued member of the NPT, yet it had nuclear weapons hidden in South Korea from the end of the Korean War until 1994, where they tacitly, but not overtly, stated that they had removed all such weapons. Also, do folks here know who the 3 nuclear states are that have declared that they will not engage in preemptive strike? You can just shout out.
North Korea.
China, North Korea.
India.
Julian, you answered all the questions. So North Korea, China, and India are the only states that have declared that they will not engage in preemptive strike. All the other nuclear states, most notably the United States, all reserve the right to preemptively nuclear strike another state.
So in South Korea, the peace talks have been framed as one of President Moon's achievements. He's given himself the role of silent mediator, 조용한 중재자, between the North and the U.S., with the ultimate goal of bringing peace to the peninsula. While looking to sign a peace treaty and adhere to the Panmunjom Declaration, Moon announced the cancellation of several joint U.S. and ROK military exercises, including Uchi Freedom Guardian, which is usually scheduled for August, and next year's Key Resolve and Full Eagle exercises. However, despite these positive steps taken towards de-escalating tensions with the North, the Moon administration has what can be described as a conflicted approach to the peace process. The South Korean government is not willing to risk its relationship with the U.S. so far, as it's not been critical of the U.S. as a nuclear power when speaking of denuclearization, and it's not been maintaining its status quo in its dealings with the U.S. military. THAAD, which if you don't know is a missile defense and radar system with surveillance capability that was installed by the United States and the South Korean military in Seongju. There were ongoing daily protests for years from the local residents of Seongju against the THAAD installation, but it was installed. And there were also well-organized protests against the building of a new naval base in Jeju Island. Since Moon has come to power, his administration's done nothing to respond to the local residents' pleas for peace and justice. THAAD is operational. The naval base in Jeju has been built despite the protests, and despite that they had international support. And the naval base is even welcoming the U.S. naval forces and is going to host International Fleet Week, even though it was purported that the base was for the South Korean Navy. These two domestic issues show that the demands of the people are put behind the demands of the alliance between South Korea and the United States. And even when the Korean people's needs are aligned with the path to peace. There are more domestic issues that aren't being addressed by Moon's administration while the international peace process takes center stage, such as the divisive minimum wage debates in South Korea. There was another Sangyong auto worker suicide from the rehiring struggle, the Hyundai Metal Workers Union struggle against wage discrepancies, the teachers' union fighting for legitimacy, and slow employment creation, and so on. So it seems that the peace process takes priority over the many pressing issues of South Korean life.
As for how the U.S. government is approaching this moment, there seems to be a lack of consensus in Washington with various factions. There are the neoconservative hawks in the White House, such as John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and Vice President Pence, who want denuclearization of North Korea before anything else. There are Democrats in Congress, such as Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, who oppose Trump and the White House politically, but essentially have the same demands as the neocons, hawks. That is, complete denuclearization of North Korea first. Meanwhile, Mike Pompeo and the team that has been leading the negotiations with North Korea have on occasion shown openness to reason and have alluded to the need for long-term phased-in denuclearization. Finally, there's a very small minority of Democrats, such as Ro Khanna in California, who sees talk and engagement with North Korea as necessary, who support a more incremental approach to denuclearization, and who understands the need to reevaluate U.S. military provocations, such as the joint military exercises with South Korea.
But you're going to be sitting down here.
And then we're going to look at that one.
Come closer. I'm not sure.
Julian, come down there. Not really, but I don't think it's possible.
Yeah. Come more.
Hey, Eugene. I'm no photographer.
NJT, what are you doing out there?
Trying to take a take about 10 minutes.
Take a long time plus.
Today.
Come, JT. Okay.
Here we go.
Don't move. This is panorama.
Yeah, panorama. Okay.